about you guys, but I am really looking forward to Jessica Jones Season 2. It's one of my favorite Netflix series, and the character really approaches the Marvel Universe from a different angle. I mean, even though she lives in a world of superheroes and possesses phenomenal powers herself, at her core, the character is really a detective.
Premiering in Alias No. 1 in 2001, we're presented with an update on the classic hard-boiled detective series adapted to the superhero genre. Where a film noir detective might be a disgraced cop or simply a crusty individual whose life is beaten down, Jessica was a failed superhero who found herself at the bottom of a bottle after a beatdown Sam Spade couldn't imagine. But as you might suspect, she's far from the first detective in comics. When the comic book industry was cutting its teeth, detective fiction was everywhere. From hard-boiled novels to film noir movies, from radio drama to newspaper comics, from private detectives like Nick and Nora Charles to police detectives like Dick Tracy. Detective fiction was ubiquitous, and it stood to reason comic books would embrace it with the same fervor as they embraced westerns, pulp heroes, and cartoon animals. One pre-New Fun magazine introduced Dan Dunn, a detective, and the first original character to be introduced in the comic magazine medium.
In fact, in the early days of comics, when most books were mixed-bag anthology series featuring a variety of stories in different styles, the first comic to focus on a single type of story was about detectives.
Detective Picture Stories by Centaur Comics featured stories about Egan of the Homicide Squad, parody features Spurlock and Watkins, and several other tales, all featuring detectives. They weren't all great, but they definitely demonstrated a market existed, and that market was shortly given a much more significant treat in the form of Detective Comics No. 1, the first flagship title by the company today known as DC. Although the title's most important character wouldn't come around until issue 27, the first issue gave us Speed Saunders and Slam Bradley, two characters who still appear today, along with humorous characters like Gumshoe Gus and Eagle-Eye Jake, Western detective Buck Marshall, and the intriguing Cosmo, the Phantom of Disguise. Dillingwater steps back, pulls off his wig, and reveals himself as Cosmo. "Well, well, Toro, you were not clever enough this time, eh?"
When superheroes started arriving on the scene, a lot of them were detectives in their secret identity because, like reporters, it was an easy way to get them to the scene of trouble. But that wasn't the only genre that got blended.
"We have to stamp out these vampires of Pluto that have invaded Earth. Kinda surprised, eh, Laws? Well, you see, when you sent me out for the prisoner, I untied his hands and gave him his gun. You two are going to the hospital. Maybe they'll teach you hospitality."
Detectives were everywhere in the Golden Age. And then less so. As superheroes started to die out in the late 40s, detectives kinda did too.
They never completely disappeared, but for a while they got absorbed by the violent crime comics such as those published by EC, and when the Comics Code made those crime comics go away, detectives sort of faded away with them. Even mainstays like Batman, known for his great detective skills, and newspaper hero Dick Tracy saw genre shifts. The once world's greatest detective spent a good deal of the 50s having time travel adventures and solving crimes by putting on wacky costumes rather than being the detective that Detective Comics would indicate. And Dick Tracy's deformed villains and police gadgetry gave way in the 60s to space travel, moon princesses, and atomic laser beams. As the focus of mainstream comics narrowed more and more over the years, detectives as a genre never really came back into the limelight. Sure, characters like Spider-Woman would have detective careers, and detectives like Jason Bard and Harvey Bullock would serve as strong supporting characters. As a genre, it never really found its footing again. Still, in the 80s, DC gave us Joni Thunder, a genre-bending update of a Golden Age classic, replacing hapless nitwit Johnny Thunder with a sassy private eye, whose magic genie was more a tool in her detective's arsenal than the focus of the story. And not long after, Marvel gave us Dakota North, a freelance detective who went from a low-key miniseries in 1986 to semi-regular appearances in Daredevil.
Which brings us back to Jessica Jones. Now, in the comics nowadays, she's mostly a supporting character for the Avengers, but on Netflix, she's a standout star and a reminder of the great comic book detectives. And that is Jessica Jones' Golden Age influence.
Stick 'em up, Two Fingers. You're under arrest.